In the grand ballroom where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, Prince Alexander's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I choose Catherine." 3 simple words that would shatter a kingdom's expectations, break an engagement that had been 20 years in the making, and prove that sometimes the heart's truth is worth more than a crown. What happened in those fateful moments when duty collided with desire? When a prince chose love over legacy? This is the story of how one decision changed 3 lives forever, and why the woman who had waited decades for this moment found herself trembling as silence fell across the room. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Raven's Hollow Castle like a shroud of secrets. Catherine Mills adjusted her simple woolen cloak and stepped through the servants' entrance, just as she had every day for the past 3 years. Her footsteps echoed softly against the worn stone steps as she made her way to the royal kitchens, where the day's preparations for the kingdom's most anticipated announcement would soon begin. At 26, Catherine possessed a quiet beauty that seemed to bloom from within. Her auburn hair caught the lamplight as she moved through the dimly lit corridors, and her green eyes held a wisdom that spoke of someone who had learned life's lessons early. She had come to the castle not seeking adventure or romance, but simply to earn an honest living and support her ailing grandmother in the village below. The castle was already alive with activity despite the early hour. Servants hurried past carrying linens and silver, their whispers filling the air with nervous energy. Today was the day Prince Alexander would officially announce his engagement to Lady Cordelia Ashworth, a union that had been arranged before either of them could walk. The match would unite 2 powerful families and secure the kingdom's eastern borders, a political necessity that had been planned with the precision of a military campaign. Catherine made her way to the herb garden, her daily routine unchanged despite the monumental events unfolding around her. She had been appointed the castle's head herbalist after demonstrating an almost magical ability to heal with plants and remedies passed down through generations of her family. The position afforded her a small cottage on the grounds and a comfortable income, but, more importantly, it had given her access to the castle's vast library during her evening hours. As she knelt among the rosemary and thyme, Catherine tried to push away the strange melancholy that had settled over her in recent weeks. She told herself it was merely the changing season, the way autumn always brought a sense of endings and transitions. She refused to acknowledge that it might have anything to do with the prince's impending engagement, or the way her heart had begun to race during their brief encounters in the castle's winding corridors. Prince Alexander Thornfield was everything a future king should be, and nothing like what Catherine had expected. At 30, he possessed the strong jaw and commanding presence of his royal bloodline, but his dark blue eyes held a gentleness that surprised her. Unlike many nobles she had observed, he treated the castle staff with genuine respect, remembering their names and asking after their families. He had visited her herb gardens several times, initially claiming interest in the medicinal properties of various plants, but Catherine suspected he simply enjoyed the peaceful sanctuary it provided from his increasingly demanding royal duties. Their conversations had been proper and brief, yet Catherine found herself treasuring every word. He spoke of books he had read, places he hoped to visit, and dreams that seemed impossibly distant from his destined path as king. In those moments, she glimpsed not the prince, but the man beneath the crown, and that man seemed as trapped by duty as she was freed by her simple life. The morning progressed with unusual intensity. Lady Margaret, the head housekeeper, appeared in the garden looking flustered, her gray hair escaping from its usually perfect arrangement. "Catherine, dear, I need your help," she said, wringing her hands. "Lady Cordelia has arrived early, and she's requesting some sort of calming tea. She seems quite agitated." Catherine nodded and gathered her supplies. Lady Cordelia Ashworth was known throughout the kingdom for her beauty and her sharp tongue in equal measure. The daughter of a powerful duke, she had been raised knowing that her marriage to Prince Alexander was not a matter of if, but when. She possessed the pale, ethereal beauty favored by the court, with platinum blonde hair and ice blue eyes that seemed to see everything and forgive nothing. As Catherine prepared the chamomile and lavender tea, she couldn't help but wonder what had caused Lady Cordelia's distress. Perhaps the reality of the impending announcement had finally struck her. Despite the political necessity of their union, it was well known that the prince and his intended bride were virtual strangers who had spent their lives preparing for a marriage that existed only on paper. The castle's great hall was being transformed for the evening's celebration. Tapestries bearing both family crests were hung with military precision, while servants polished every surface until it gleamed. The finest wines were being brought up from the cellars, and the kitchen staff worked frantically to prepare a feast worthy of the announcement that would shape the kingdom's future. Catherine delivered the tea to Lady Cordelia's chambers and was struck by the young woman's obvious distress. Despite her reputation for coldness, Lady Cordelia appeared fragile and overwhelmed as she paced before the tall windows overlooking the castle grounds. She accepted the tea with a barely audible thanks, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the delicate porcelain cup. "Tell me," Lady Cordelia said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you believe in love?" The question caught Catherine off guard. She studied the young noblewoman's face, seeing past the perfect makeup to the uncertainty beneath. "I believe love exists, my lady, though I think it means different things to different people." Lady Cordelia laughed bitterly. "How fortunate for you to have such philosophical freedom. Some of us are not afforded the luxury of choice in such matters." She turned back to the window, effectively dismissing Catherine, but not before adding, "Though I suspect even those who believe they have no choice might surprise themselves in the end." As Catherine left the chamber, she puzzled over Lady Cordelia's cryptic words. There had been something almost prophetic in her tone, as though she knew secrets that others did not. Catherine pushed the encounter from her mind as she returned to her duties, but the conversation lingered like an unfinished melody. The afternoon brought Prince Alexander to the herb garden, though this visit felt different from the others. He appeared restless, his usual calm demeanor replaced by barely contained energy. He walked among the plants without his typical purpose, touching leaves absently and asking questions that seemed designed more to prolong the conversation than gather information. "Catherine," he said finally, stopping beside a patch of late-blooming roses, "do you ever wonder what your life might have been like if you had made different choices?" The question was so similar to Lady Cordelia's that Catherine felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. "I think we all wonder about the paths we didn't take, Your Highness. But dwelling on them too long might prevent us from appreciating the path we're on." He smiled at her response, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "You have a way of making wisdom sound simple. I've read countless philosophy texts that attempt to address such questions with far less clarity." "Perhaps wisdom isn't meant to be complicated," Catherine replied, then immediately regretted the boldness of her words. She was a servant speaking to a prince about matters that were far beyond her station. Instead of taking offense, Prince Alexander stepped closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Catherine, if I were to tell you that everything was about to change, that tonight would alter the course of many lives, what would you say?" The intensity in his voice made her heart race. She searched his face for clues to his meaning but found only a storm of emotions she couldn't begin to decipher. "I would say that change, even difficult change, sometimes brings opportunities we never expected." He nodded slowly, as though her words confirmed something he already knew. "You are remarkably wise for someone so young. I hope you'll remember that wisdom in the days to come." Before Catherine could ask what he meant, Prince Alexander turned and strode back toward the castle, leaving her standing among the roses with more questions than answers. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the garden, and Catherine felt as though she was standing at the edge of some great precipice without knowing what lay in the darkness below. The evening's preparations reached a crescendo as the sun set behind the castle's towers. Catherine changed into her finest dress, a simple but elegant gown in deep emerald that her grandmother had sewn for special occasions. As a member of the household staff, she would be expected to attend the announcement, though she would remain in the background with the other servants. The great hall had been transformed into something magical. Hundreds of candles flickered from elaborate candelabras, their light reflecting off the polished suits of armor and creating dancing patterns on the ancient tapestries. The kingdom's most important nobles had gathered, their finest clothing creating a rainbow of silk and velvet. Musicians played softly in one corner, while servants moved through the crowd offering wine and delicacies. Catherine took her place along the wall with the other staff members, trying to remain invisible while observing the spectacle unfolding before her. She spotted Lady Cordelia near the throne, resplendent in a gown of ice-blue silk that matched her eyes perfectly. Her blonde hair was arranged in an elaborate style befitting a future queen, and diamonds glittered at her throat and wrists. Yet despite her stunning appearance, Catherine noticed the tension in her posture, the way she gripped her wine glass perhaps a bit too tightly. Prince Alexander entered the hall with the bearing of a man walking to his execution rather than his engagement announcement. He wore the deep blue and gold of the royal colors, with the ceremonial sword of his house at his side. The assembled nobles bowed as he passed, but Catherine was close enough to see the muscle ticking in his jaw, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The king, an aging monarch whose illness had been carefully hidden from the public, took his place on the throne with obvious effort. His queen stood beside him, her face a mask of royal composure that revealed nothing of her thoughts. The moment had arrived that would seal the fate of the kingdom's future, yet Catherine felt as though she were watching actors in a play rather than real people making real choices. A herald stepped forward and called for silence. The hall fell quiet except for the soft crackling of the fires in the enormous hearths. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the formal announcement that would make official what had been planned for 2 decades. Prince Alexander moved to the center of the hall, and Catherine felt her breath catch in her throat. He looked directly at her across the crowded room, their eyes meeting for just a moment before he turned his attention to the assembled nobles. What she saw in that brief glance made her blood run cold. It was the look of a man who was about to change everything, regardless of the consequences. "My lords and ladies," Prince Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly through the great hall. "I have called you here tonight to make an announcement regarding my future and the future of our kingdom." Lady Cordelia stepped forward slightly, preparing for the formal declaration that would make her his betrothed. The assembled nobles leaned in, anticipating the words that would cement political alliances and secure the kingdom's borders. But Prince Alexander's next words would shatter every expectation in the room and change the course of history itself. The silence in the great hall stretched like a taut bowstring, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Prince Alexander stood in the center of the room, every eye fixed upon him, yet Catherine felt as though he was speaking directly to her when he continued. "For 20 years, plans have been made for my future without my consent or consideration. Tonight, I stand before you not just as your prince, but as a man who has finally found the courage to choose his own destiny." A murmur rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Lady Cordelia's face had gone pale, but she maintained her composure with the training of someone born to nobility. The king leaned forward on his throne, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. "Lady Cordelia," Prince Alexander continued, turning toward his intended bride, "you are a woman of grace and beauty, and you deserve a husband who can love you with his whole heart. I cannot be that man, and I will not condemn us both to a marriage built on political necessity rather than genuine affection." The gasps from the assembled nobles were audible now, whispers spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Catherine felt her knees weaken and was grateful for the wall at her back. This couldn't be happening. Princes didn't simply reject arranged marriages, especially not marriages that had been planned since childhood. Lady Cordelia lifted her chin, and Catherine saw a flash of something that might have been relief cross her features before it was replaced by the mask of wounded dignity expected of a spurned noblewoman. "Your Highness," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "while I cannot pretend this is not unexpected, I appreciate your honesty. Perhaps we are both fortunate that you have discovered this truth now rather than after vows have been spoken." The king rose from his throne, his face flushed with anger or illness. Catherine couldn't tell which. "Alexander," he said, his voice carrying the weight of royal authority, "you forget yourself. This union has been blessed by treaty and tradition. You cannot simply, 'I can,' and 'I do.'" Prince Alexander interrupted, a breach of protocol that sent another wave of shock through the assembly. "Father, I know the political implications of my choice, and I accept full responsibility for them. But I will not sacrifice my life and Lady Cordelia's happiness for the convenience of others." Catherine watched in fascination and terror as history unfolded before her eyes. She had never witnessed such a dramatic rejection of royal duty, and she couldn't begin to imagine the consequences that would follow. The eastern borders that the marriage was meant to secure, the political alliances that hung in the balance, the very stability of the kingdom itself seemed to tremble on the edge of chaos. But Prince Alexander was not finished. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the assembled nobles until it found Catherine standing among the servants. Time seemed to slow as he began walking toward her, each step echoing in the stunned silence of the great hall. "There is another matter I must address," he said, never taking his eyes from Catherine's face. I have found love where I least expected it, with someone whose worth is measured not in titles or dowries, but in the content of her character and the goodness of her heart. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face as every head in the hall turned to follow the prince's gaze. She wanted to run, to disappear into the shadows, but her feet seemed rooted to the ancient stone floor. This was madness. Princes did not fall in love with herb gardeners. They certainly did not announce such feelings in front of the entire nobility. Prince Alexander stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the determination burning in his dark blue eyes. The assembled nobles watched in stunned silence as he extended his hand toward her. "Catherine Mills," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. "You have shown me what it means to live authentically, to find joy in simple pleasures, and to treat every person with dignity regardless of their station. You have taught me that love is not something to be arranged or negotiated, but something to be discovered and cherished." Catherine stared at his outstretched hand as though it were a snake that might strike her. She was acutely aware of hundreds of eyes watching her every movement, of the whispers growing louder as the seconds ticked by. This was impossible. She was a commoner, the granddaughter of a village healer. She had no place in the world of princes and politics. "Your Highness," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "you cannot mean this. Think of your duty, your kingdom, my happiness," he interrupted gently. "My chance at a life lived honestly rather than according to other people's plans. Catherine, I have thought of nothing else for weeks. I know the obstacles we would face, the challenges that lie ahead. But I also know that a life without love is no life at all." Behind them, Catherine could hear Lady Cordelia addressing the crowd, her voice strong and clear as she attempted to salvage what remained of the evening's dignity. "Perhaps," she was saying, "love should be celebrated wherever it is found, regardless of the circumstances of its discovery." The words were gracious, but Catherine detected an underlying current of something else in Lady Cordelia's tone. Relief, perhaps, or even gratitude. Had the arranged marriage been as much a prison for her as it had been for Prince Alexander? The king's voice boomed across the hall, filled with rage and disbelief. "This is preposterous. Alexander, you will return to your chambers immediately, and we will discuss this matter privately. Miss Mills, you will remove yourself from the premises at once." But Prince Alexander stepped protectively in front of Catherine, shielding her from his father's anger. "No," he said firmly. "I am of age, father, and I am the heir to this throne whether you approve of my choices or not. Catherine has done nothing wrong except capture the heart of a man who was foolish enough to believe he could live without love." The confrontation between father and son crackled with tension that seemed to charge the very air in the great hall. Catherine could feel the weight of history being written in these moments, could sense that nothing would ever be the same after tonight. The carefully ordered world of the kingdom was crashing down around them, and she was somehow at the center of the destruction. "Think of the alliances," one of the dukes called out from the crowd. "The treaties that depend upon this union. Would you jeopardize the security of the entire kingdom for the sake of love?" Prince Alexander finished for him. "Yes, I would. Because a kingdom built on lies and sacrificed happiness is not worth preserving. There must be other ways to secure our borders, other methods of building alliances. But there is only one way to build a life worth living, and that is with honesty and courage." Catherine felt tears stinging her eyes as she listened to him defend their impossible love in front of the most powerful people in the kingdom. The courage it must have taken to stand up before this assembly and reject 20 years of planning, to choose an uncertain future with a commoner over the security of a politically advantageous marriage, was beyond anything she had ever imagined. Yet even as her heart soared at his words, her practical mind was already calculating the cost of his choice. The whispers around them had grown into a buzz of conversation as nobles began discussing the implications of what they had witnessed. Some voices expressed outrage, others curiosity, and a few seemed almost admiring of the prince's dramatic gesture. Lady Cordelia approached them through the crowd, her ice blue gown rustling against the stone floor. Catherine expected anger or jealousy, but when the noblewoman reached them, her expression was surprisingly calm. "Your Highness," Lady Cordelia said to Prince Alexander, "I believe I owe you a debt of gratitude." The prince looked surprised, and Catherine was equally confused by the unexpected response. Lady Cordelia smiled, the first genuine expression Catherine had seen from her all day. "You see," Lady Cordelia continued. While our families were busy arranging our futures, I was busy falling in love with someone else entirely. Your courage in rejecting our engagement gives me the freedom to pursue my own happiness, something I never thought possible. The revelation sent another wave of whispers through the crowd. Catherine began to understand that perhaps Prince Alexander had not been the only one trapped by the expectations of others, that Lady Cordelia had been equally imprisoned by duty and tradition. Then, you're not angry? Prince Alexander asked, his relief evident in his voice. Quite the opposite, Lady Cordelia replied. I'm grateful. Though I suspect we're both about to face considerable challenges as a result of tonight's revelations. She was right, of course. Catherine could already see the storm clouds gathering in the faces of the assembled nobles. The king looked apoplectic, his face purple with rage as he gestured animatedly to his advisors. Several dukes were huddled in urgent conversation, no doubt discussing the political ramifications of the failed engagement. The entire carefully constructed world of royal protocol was crumbling around them. Prince Alexander must have sensed her growing panic because he moved closer, his presence both comforting and terrifying. Catherine, he said quietly, I know this is overwhelming. I know I have no right to ask you to share the burden of my choice. But I want you to know that whatever happens next, tonight has been worth it just to speak the truth aloud. Catherine looked up into his face, seeing past the prince to the man who had just sacrificed everything for the chance at happiness. The enormity of what he had done was staggering, but so was the love she saw reflected in his eyes. For the first time since he had begun speaking, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that this impossible dream might somehow become reality. What happens now? She whispered, aware that their conversation was being watched and analyzed by everyone in the room. Now, Prince Alexander said, taking her hand in his. We face the consequences together. If you'll have me. The simplicity of the question belied its significance. Catherine knew that saying yes would change her life forever, would thrust her into a world of politics and protocol for which she had no preparation. She would face criticism, scandal, and challenges she couldn't even imagine. But she also knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she would rather face those challenges with Alexander than live safely without him. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger with the word. Yes, I'll have you. The hall erupted into chaos as her acceptance reached the ears of the assembled nobles. Voices rose in argument, supporters and detractors making their positions known. The king stormed from the room, followed by several of his advisors, while others remained to witness the unfolding drama. But Catherine heard none of it. In that moment, standing in the center of the storm they had created, she was aware only of Alexander's hand in hers, and the extraordinary courage it had taken for both of them to choose love over safety. The real challenges were yet to come, but, for now, they had each other, and somehow that felt like enough to face whatever the future might hold. Dawn broke over Ravenshollow Castle with an unusual quiet that felt more ominous than peaceful. Catherine sat in her small cottage, still wearing the emerald dress from the previous evening, staring at her hands as though they belonged to someone else. The hands that had been kissed by a prince in front of half the kingdom's nobility. The hands that had sealed her fate with a simple word, yes. Sleep had been impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the assembled nobles, heard the king's furious voice, felt the weight of 100 stares boring into her. She had spent the dark hours pacing her small living room, trying to comprehend how her simple life had transformed into something from a fairy tale in the span of a single evening. A soft knock at her door made her jump. Through the window, she could see Lady Margaret standing on her doorstep, the older woman's face grave and worried. Catherine opened the door to find the head housekeeper holding a tea service and wearing an expression that suggested she had aged several years overnight. Oh, my dear, Lady Margaret said, setting down the tray and immediately enveloping Catherine in a motherly embrace. What a night! What a terrible, wonderful, impossible night! Catherine felt tears threaten again as she accepted the comfort of the older woman's arms. Lady Margaret had been like a mother to her since her arrival at the castle, and Catherine desperately needed her wisdom and support. I don't know what to do, Catherine whispered. I never wanted this. I never meant for any of this to happen. Lady Margaret pulled back to study Catherine's face, her gray eyes kind but serious. Child, do you love him? Not the prince, not the crown, but the man himself. The question was simple, but the answer came from the deepest part of Catherine's heart. Yes, God help me. Yes, I do. Then, That's something, at least, Lady Margaret said, pouring tea with hands that trembled slightly. Love doesn't solve everything, but it's a foundation to build on. The question is whether that foundation is strong enough to support what's coming. As if summoned by her words, another knock echoed through the cottage. This time, it was one of the royal guards, his face carefully neutral as he delivered his message. Miss Mills, His Royal Highness requests your presence in the East Tower Library at your earliest convenience. Catherine's stomach clenched with nervousness. The formal language couldn't disguise the fact that this was a summons, not a request. She thanked the guard and turned to Lady Margaret, who was already moving toward the wardrobe. You'll need something appropriate for a private audience with the prince, the housekeeper said, pulling out Catherine's second-best dress, a simple but elegant gown in deep blue. And Catherine, remember that you're not just Catherine the herb gardener anymore. You're the woman who captured the heart of the future king. Hold your head high. The walk through the castle felt like a journey through a battlefield. Servants she had known for years avoided her eyes or whispered behind their hands as she passed. Guards maintained their professional composure, but Catherine could sense their curiosity and, in some cases, disapproval. The fairy tale romance that had seemed magical in the candlelit great hall felt more like a scandal in the harsh light of morning. The East Tower Library was Prince Alexander's private sanctuary, a place where he could escape the demands of royal life and lose himself in books. Catherine had never been there before, but she had heard it described as a tower room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, with tall windows overlooking the kingdom's rolling hills. She climbed the winding stone steps with growing anxiety, her footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. At the top, she found a heavy wooden door standing slightly ajar. She knocked softly and heard Alexander's voice bid her enter. The library was everything she had imagined, and more. Thousands of books filled towering shelves that reached toward a vaulted ceiling painted with stars and constellations. Comfortable chairs were arranged near the tall windows, and a small fire crackled in an ornate fireplace. It was a room that spoke of learning and contemplation, a fitting retreat for a prince who valued knowledge as much as power. Prince Alexander stood at one of the windows, his back to the door as he gazed out at the kingdom spread below. He was dressed simply in riding clothes rather than formal court attire, his dark hair slightly tousled, as though he had run his hands through it repeatedly. When he turned to face her, Catherine was shocked by the weariness in his eyes, the lines of stress that had appeared overnight. "Catherine," he said, crossing the room to take her hands in his. "Thank you for coming. I know last night was overwhelming." She studied his face, searching for any sign of regret or second thoughts. "Do you wish you hadn't done it?" she asked quietly. The question seemed to surprise him. "What? No, never." He led her to the chairs by the window, settling beside her as they looked out over the kingdom. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life. But I would be lying if I said I wasn't concerned about what comes next." As if to underscore his words, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the courtyard below. Looking down, Catherine could see a group of nobles departing the castle, their departure hasty and clearly motivated by anger rather than courtesy. Among them she recognized the Duke of Eastmarch, Lady Cordelia's father, his face thunderous even from their elevated vantage point. "How bad is it?" Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "The Duke of Eastmarch is furious, naturally. He's threatening to withdraw from several trade agreements, and is making noises about renegotiating the treaties that protect our eastern borders. 3 other dukes have followed his lead, and my father." He paused, his jaw tightening. "My father has confined himself to his chambers and refuses to speak to me." Catherine felt her heart sink. The political ramifications she had feared were already beginning to manifest, and they had only just begun. "And Lady Cordelia is handling the situation with more grace than the rest of us combined," Alexander replied with obvious admiration. "She departed this morning with her head held high, publicly stating that she wished us both happiness and that true love should be celebrated regardless of circumstances. Her dignity in the face of such a public rejection has actually enhanced her reputation rather than damaged it." There was more he wasn't telling her. Catherine could sense it. "What else?" she pressed gently. Alexander stood and began pacing, a habit she had observed when he was particularly troubled. "There are rumors that some of the northern lords are questioning whether I'm fit to rule. They're saying that a king who cannot honor his commitments to his own nobles cannot be trusted to honor his commitments to the kingdom." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. She had known there would be consequences to their choice, but the possibility that Alexander might lose his birthright had never occurred to her. The idea that their love could cost him the throne was unbearable. "Then, we must end this," she said, rising from her chair with sudden resolve. "I'll leave the castle, disappear somewhere far from here. You can tell everyone it was a momentary madness, that you've come to your senses. There's still time to repair the damage." Alexander stopped pacing and turned to stare at her, his expression a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "Is that what you think of me? That I would sacrifice our love the moment it became inconvenient?" "I think you're a good man who was raised to be a king," Catherine replied, fighting back tears. "I think your duty to your people must come before your personal desires, no matter how much it costs us both." He crossed the room in 3 quick strides, taking her face in his hands and forcing her to look directly into his eyes. "Listen to me, Catherine Mills. I would rather spend my life as a commoner with you than as a king without you. Yes, there will be challenges. Yes, we will face opposition and criticism and possibly even danger. But I refuse to believe that choosing love over political convenience makes me unfit to rule. If anything, it proves that I understand what truly matters." The conviction in his voice was almost enough to convince her, but Catherine had learned to be practical about life's harsh realities. "And if the kingdom tears itself apart because of our choice, if wars are fought, and people die because you chose love over duty, then we'll find another way," Alexander said firmly. "Catherine, I've spent my entire life preparing to be king. I know the responsibilities that come with the crown, and I know that sometimes difficult choices must be made. But I also know that a king who rules without understanding love cannot truly serve his people." Before Catherine could respond, urgent footsteps echoed on the stairway outside. Moments later, the library door burst open to admit Sir Edmund Blackwood, the captain of the Royal Guard. The older knight's face was flushed from his rapid climb, and his expression was grave. "Your Highness," he said, barely pausing to catch his breath, "forgive the intrusion, but there are urgent matters that require your immediate attention." Alexander straightened, instantly transforming from lovesick prince to royal heir. "What's happened?" "A messenger has arrived from the eastern borders. Lord Ravencrest reports unusual military activity from our neighbors. Troops massing, supply lines being established. He believes they may be testing our resolve in light of recent developments." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. The very scenario she had feared was beginning to unfold. Their enemies were seeing the kingdom's internal turmoil as an opportunity for aggression. "How many troops?" Alexander asked, his voice sharp with authority. "Unknown, but Lord Ravencrest estimates at least 2,000, with more arriving daily. He's requesting reinforcements and wants to know how he should respond to any provocations." Alexander nodded grimly. "Send word that I'll be departing for the eastern borders within the week. I want detailed reports from all border commanders, and I want our own troop movements to begin immediately." Sir Edmund looked surprised. "Your Highness, perhaps it would be wiser to send a general in your place. Given the current political climate, your presence might be needed here." "My presence is needed wherever the kingdom faces threats," Alexander replied firmly. "And if there are those who question my fitness to rule, then I'll prove my worth on the battlefield rather than in the throne room." Catherine listened to the exchange with growing horror. Alexander was planning to ride directly into danger, and she knew it was partly because of the pressure their relationship had created. If he were killed in battle, their love would be responsible not just for political upheaval, but for the death of the kingdom's rightful heir. After Sir Edmund departed with his orders, Catherine and Alexander stood in silence, the weight of responsibility settling around them like a heavy cloak. The romantic dream of the previous evening was crashing against the harsh realities of royal duty and political necessity. "You see now why this is impossible," Catherine said quietly. "Our love is already endangering the kingdom." Alexander moved to the window, looking out at the lands he would one day rule. "Our love isn't endangering anything. The ambitions of greedy neighbors and the wounded pride of disappointed nobles are creating these problems. We cannot let fear dictate our choices." But Catherine could see the doubt creeping into his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to bear a heavier burden than they had just hours before. The prince who had declared his love so boldly in the great hall was beginning to understand the true cost of his choice. As if sensing her thoughts, Alexander turned back to her, his expression softening. "Catherine, I need you to know that whatever happens in the coming days or weeks, I regret nothing about last night. You have shown me what it means to live authentically, and I will not apologize for choosing happiness over political convenience. Catherine nodded, but her heart was breaking as she realized that love, no matter how pure or strong, might not be enough to overcome the forces arrayed against them. The fairy tale was beginning to reveal its darker chapters, and she feared that their story might not have the happy ending they had dared to imagine. The sound of more hoofbeats from the courtyard drew their attention back to the window. This time, it was messengers arriving rather than nobles departing, but Catherine suspected the news they brought would be no more welcome than the morning's departures. Their moment of private happiness was over. The real test of their love was about to begin, and Catherine wondered if either of them was strong enough to survive what was coming. The war room in the lower levels of Ravenshollow Castle hummed with tense activity as maps were spread across massive oak tables, and messengers arrived hourly with updates from the kingdom's far-flung borders. Catherine stood in the shadows near the doorway, officially present to provide herbal remedies for the stress-induced ailments plaguing the military advisors, but truly there to observe the man she loved as he transformed into the strategic leader his kingdom needed. 3 days had passed since the dramatic announcement in the Great Hall, and the political landscape had shifted with alarming speed. The initial shock had given way to calculated responses from various factions, each attempting to use the situation to their advantage. What had begun as a personal choice was rapidly becoming a matter of national security. Prince Alexander stood at the head of the great table, his finger tracing the eastern borders on a detailed map. The casual prince who had courted her in the herb garden was gone, replaced by a man whose bearing spoke of command and whose eyes held the weight of difficult decisions. Catherine felt both pride and sorrow watching the transformation, understanding that this was the king he was destined to become, with or without her at his side. The reports are consistent, General Morrison was saying, his gray beard bristling with frustration. Our neighbors are definitely testing our resolve. They're not making overt moves yet, but the troop buildups suggest they're preparing for the possibility of conflict. Sir Edmund Blackwood pointed to several marked positions on the map. Intelligence suggests they believe our internal discord makes us vulnerable. The broken engagement has been interpreted as a sign of weakness, a kingdom unable to honor its commitments. Catherine winced at the words. Every reminder of the political cost of their love felt like a dagger to her heart. She could see the tension in Alexander's shoulders, the way his jaw clenched when the conversation turned to the consequences of his choice. Then, we proved them wrong, Alexander said firmly. I want our response to be swift and decisive. Not aggressive, but unmistakably strong. They need to understand that personal matters do not affect our national resolve. The discussion continued for another hour, covering troop movements, supply lines, and diplomatic communications. Catherine listened with growing understanding of the complexity facing the kingdom. It wasn't simply a matter of defending borders. It was about maintaining credibility and demonstrating that the monarchy remained stable despite the dramatic changes in royal succession plans. When the meeting finally concluded and the various advisors and generals had departed, Alexander slumped into his chair, the weight of leadership evident in every line of his body. Catherine emerged from the shadows, carrying a cup of the stress-relieving tea she had prepared specifically for these long strategy sessions. You're pushing yourself too hard, she said gently, setting the cup before him. Alexander looked up at her with tired eyes, gratitude, and love warring with frustration in his expression. I have to. Every decision I make now is being scrutinized for signs that emotion has compromised my judgment. I cannot afford to appear weak or indecisive. Catherine settled into the chair beside him, studying the maps that covered the table. Tell me honestly, Alexander, are you having second thoughts? The question hung between them like a sword waiting to fall. Catherine held her breath as Alexander considered his response, afraid of what he might say, but needing to know where they truly stood. About loving you? Never, he said finally, reaching for her hand. About the timing of my declaration? Perhaps. I acted from the heart without fully considering the political ramifications, and now the kingdom is paying the price for my impulsiveness. The admission was like a physical blow to Catherine's chest. She had suspected as much, but hearing him acknowledge that their love was creating problems for the kingdom made her feel like the worst kind of selfish fool. There's something else, Alexander continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Something the advisors haven't told you yet. Catherine's blood chilled. What? Alexander stood and moved to a smaller map mounted on the wall, this one showing the internal divisions of the kingdom. Several regions were marked with red ink, their significance unclear to Catherine, but obviously meaningful to him. 3 of the northern duchies have formally requested an audience to discuss matters of succession, he said, not meeting her eyes. They're not openly challenging my right to the throne, but they're questioning whether the marriage situation indicates instability in my character. Catherine felt the room spinning around her. The situation was even worse than she had feared. They think you're unfit to rule because of me. They think I'm unfit to rule because I chose love over political expediency, Alexander corrected. But the distinction felt academic to Catherine. The result was the same. Their relationship was threatening his birthright. Before Catherine could respond, hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Moments later, Lady Margaret burst into the room, her usual composure completely shattered. "Your Highness, Miss Catherine," she gasped, trying to catch her breath. "There's been a development. Lady Cordelia has returned." Both Alexander and Catherine stared at the housekeeper in shock. Lady Cordelia's departure had been one of the few positive outcomes of the previous few days, her gracious exit allowing for some measure of damage control. Her return could only mean more complications. "Where is she?" Alexander asked, already moving toward the door. "In the rose garden, Your Highness." "But she's not alone. She's brought someone with her. A young man, well-dressed, but not nobility. They seem very close." Catherine felt a spark of hope for the first time in days. If Lady Cordelia had indeed found love elsewhere, it might provide the perfect solution to some of their political problems. A happily settled former fiancé would be much better for public opinion than a rejected and bitter one. They found Lady Cordelia exactly where Lady Margaret had indicated, seated on a stone bench in the castle's formal rose garden. She was indeed accompanied by a young man who was clearly not of noble birth, but carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to respect. He was perhaps 25, with dark hair and intelligent eyes, dressed in the finest clothes his station would allow. Lady Cordelia rose as they approached, her ice-blue eyes bright, with an emotion Catherine had never seen in them before, genuine happiness. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the cold, distant noblewoman, replaced by a young woman clearly in love. "Your Highness, Miss Mills," Lady Cordelia said, offering a graceful curtsy. "May I present Master James Fletcher, the kingdom's finest architect, and the man who has captured my heart just as thoroughly as Miss Mills has captured yours." Master Fletcher bowed respectfully, though Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders. He was clearly as uncomfortable with the social dynamics of the situation as she had been just days before. "Master Fletcher," Alexander acknowledged with a nod. "Your reputation precedes you. The cathedral restoration in the capital is spoken of throughout the kingdom." "You honor me, Your Highness," James replied, his voice steady despite the obviously nerve-wracking circumstances. Lady Cordelia stepped closer to her companion, taking his arm in a gesture that spoke of established intimacy. "James and I have known each other for 2 years. We met when Father commissioned him to design improvements to our family estate. I had always assumed our feelings were impossible, that duty would require me to marry as arranged. Your courage in following your heart has given me the strength to follow mine." Catherine felt a surge of relief, so strong it made her lightheaded. This could change everything. If Lady Cordelia was happily attached to someone else, the political narrative could shift from spurned noblewoman to mutual liberation for true love. But Alexander's expression remained cautious. "Cordelia, I'm happy for you, truly. But I have to ask why you've returned. Surely you understand the delicate situation we're all in." Lady Cordelia's smile faltered slightly, and Catherine saw a flicker of the shrewd intelligence that had always lurked beneath her beautiful exterior. "That's exactly why I've returned," she said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Alexander, the situation is more dangerous than you realize. My father isn't just angry about the broken engagement. He's actively working to undermine your claim to the throne. He's convinced several other nobles that your rejection of duty in personal matters indicates you cannot be trusted with matters of state." The words confirmed Alexander's worst fears and Catherine's growing dread. The political situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. "What are you suggesting?" Alexander asked quietly. Lady Cordelia exchanged a meaningful look with Master Fletcher before continuing. "I'm suggesting that we present a united front. If both participants in the original engagement have found love elsewhere and are publicly happy about it, the narrative changes from royal irresponsibility to romantic destiny. People love stories of true love triumphing over political arrangement, but only if everyone involved appears to benefit. Catherine began to see the logic in the proposal, but she also recognized the complexity it would add to their already complicated situation. You're suggesting that we publicly celebrate both relationships? I'm suggesting that we demonstrate to the kingdom that love, when genuine and mutual, makes everyone stronger rather than weaker, Lady Cordelia replied. James and I are prepared to face the social challenges of our different stations. Are you prepared to let us help you weather this political storm? Alexander looked thoughtful, clearly weighing the potential benefits against the risks. Catherine could see him calculating political angles, considering public perception, and evaluating the strategic value of the proposal. What does your father think of Master Fletcher? Alexander asked, cutting to the heart of the political implications. Lady Cordelia's expression darkened. He's furious, of course. But James is not without influence. His work has earned him respect among the merchant classes and even some of the minor nobility. And, importantly, his family has no political ambitions that would threaten existing power structures. Catherine realized that Lady Cordelia was essentially proposing an alliance, a way for both couples to face their challenges together rather than separately. It was politically savvy and personally appealing, but it would also require them to navigate even more complex social dynamics. There's something else. Master Fletcher spoke for the first time since the introductions, his voice quiet but firm. The common people are talking about the prince's choice, and the reaction isn't what the nobles expect. Many see it as romantic and brave, a prince choosing love over political convenience. The story is spreading through the kingdom as a tale of courage rather than irresponsibility. This was news to both Catherine and Alexander. They had been so focused on the political reactions of the nobility that they hadn't considered how their story might be perceived by the common people of the kingdom. The merchants and craftsmen, the farmers and shopkeepers, Lady Cordelia added. They understand love in ways that nobility sometimes forgets. James has heard the talk in the markets and taverns. People are saying that a king who understands love will better understand his people. Catherine felt a flicker of hope for the first time since the announcement. If public opinion was not entirely against them, perhaps there was a path forward that didn't require sacrifice of either love or duty. But, even as hope stirred, Catherine knew they were far from safety. Political support among the common people was valuable, but it was the nobility who had the power to challenge Alexander's succession. And, with military threats gathering on the borders, the kingdom needed stability more than romance. The conversation continued as the four of them walked slowly through the rose garden, discussing strategies and possibilities, risks and opportunities. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Catherine began to understand that their personal fairy tale had become something much larger and more complex than either she or Alexander had ever imagined. The choice they had made in the Great Hall was no longer just about their own happiness. It had become a catalyst for broader questions about duty and love, tradition and change, the nature of leadership in a world where personal choices had public consequences. As evening approached, Catherine realized that the real test of their love was not whether they could overcome political opposition or social challenges, but whether they could navigate the transformation of their private feelings into a public symbol without losing the authenticity that had made their love worth fighting for in the first place. The eastern borders of the kingdom stretched before them like a tapestry woven with danger and determination. Catherine rode beside Prince Alexander as their combined force of 300 soldiers made their way through the rolling hills toward Lord Ravencrest's stronghold. The decision to bring her had been controversial among the royal advisors, but Alexander had been adamant. If they were to face the future together, they would face all of it, including its most dangerous moments. 2 weeks had passed since Lady Cordelia's return and her proposal for a united front against their critics. The strategy had shown some success. Public support for both couples had grown stronger among the common people, while the narrative of mutual happiness had begun to soften some of the harsh criticism from moderate nobles. But the eastern border crisis had escalated beyond a test of political will. It had become a genuine military threat. Catherine wore practical riding clothes beneath a cloak that bore the royal colors, a visible symbol of her new position that still felt surreal every time she caught sight of herself. The transformation from herb gardener to prince's chosen companion had required lessons in protocol, politics, and, now, apparently, battlefield strategy. Lady Margaret had insisted on the lessons, arguing that Catherine needed to understand the world she was entering if she hoped to survive it. The scouts report that Lord Ravencrest's castle is just beyond the next ridge, Sir Edmund called out, riding up beside them. The captain of the Royal Guard had initially opposed Catherine's presence on what could become a military campaign, but even he had admitted that her herbal knowledge might prove valuable if there were casualties. Alexander nodded, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of enemy activity. The intelligence reports had grown increasingly alarming during their journey. What had begun as suspected troop movements had escalated into confirmed military exercises designed to intimidate and provoke. Their neighbors were clearly testing whether the kingdom's internal turmoil had weakened its resolve to defend its territory. Have there been any actual border incursions? Catherine asked, still learning to navigate the complex language of military strategy. Not yet, Alexander replied. But the provocations are increasing. Livestock stolen from border farms, merchants harassed on trade routes, armed patrols coming suspiciously close to our territory lines. They're trying to provoke us into making the first aggressive move. Catherine understood the implications. If their kingdom appeared to be the aggressor, it would justify retaliation and potentially draw other neighbors into the conflict. The political ramifications of their personal choices were being played out on a stage much larger than they had ever imagined. As they crested the ridge, Lord Ravencrest's castle came into view, a formidable structure of gray stone perched on a rocky outcropping that commanded views of the surrounding countryside. Smoke rose from cooking fires within its walls, and Catherine could see the movement of soldiers and servants going about their daily duties. It looked like exactly what it was, a fortress prepared for war. Lord Ravencrest himself met them at the castle gates, a weathered man in his 50s whose scarred face spoke of a lifetime spent defending the kingdom's borders. He bowed respectfully to Alexander, then surprised Catherine by offering her a courteous nod of acknowledgement. "Your Highness, welcome to Ironhold Castle," Lord Ravencrest said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "And, Miss Mills, the stories of your courage have preceded you even to these remote borders." Catherine felt a flush of surprise and pleasure at the unexpected respect. She had been prepared for skepticism or barely concealed hostility from the military commanders, not acknowledgement of courage she didn't feel she possessed. "The situation has deteriorated since my last report," Lord Ravencrest continued as he led them into the castle's great hall. "Yesterday, a patrol of enemy soldiers crossed 2 miles into our territory before withdrawing. They claimed it was a navigation error, but it was clearly a test of our response time and defensive capabilities." Alexander studied the maps that covered the hall's massive table, his expression growing more grim as Lord Ravencrest outlined the various provocations and escalations. Catherine watched him process the information with the focused intensity of a born strategist, and she realized that this was where he truly belonged, not in the suffocating protocol of court ceremonies, but in the clear-cut world of defending his people against external threats. "What are our options?" Alexander asked, his finger tracing the border lines on the detailed maps. "Limited," Lord Ravencrest admitted. "We're outnumbered at least 3-1 if they decide to commit to a full assault. Our advantage lies in defensive positions and superior knowledge of the terrain. But if they force us into extended conflict, we'll need reinforcements from the capital." Catherine listened to the military discussion with growing understanding of the impossible position Alexander faced. The political crisis created by their relationship had weakened the kingdom's ability to respond to external threats. Nobles who should be providing troops and resources were instead questioning his fitness to rule, while potential allies were reluctant to commit to supporting a king whose legitimacy was under challenge. As the afternoon wore on, messengers arrived with increasingly urgent reports. That evening, as they dined in Lord Ravencrest's great hall, Catherine found herself seated between Alexander and Lady Elena, Lord Ravencrest's daughter and the castle's unofficial military strategist. Lady Elena was unlike any noblewoman Catherine had met, practical, direct, and completely unimpressed by courtly protocol. She wore her dark hair in a simple braid and spoke of military tactics with the expertise of a seasoned commander. "The soldiers are talking about you," Lady Elena said to Catherine without preamble, her green eyes serious but not unkind. "They're saying that a prince brave enough to choose love over political convenience is brave enough to lead them in battle." Catherine nearly choked on her wine. "I hardly think my personal choices qualify as military credentials." "Don't underestimate the power of symbols," Lady Elena replied. "Soldiers need something to believe in beyond duty and territory. They need to believe their leaders understand what they're fighting to protect. A king who fights for love understands what's worth preserving. The conversation continued throughout the evening, and Catherine began to understand that their story had indeed become something larger than their personal relationship. Among the common soldiers and the people of the borderlands, their choice was being interpreted not as royal irresponsibility, but as evidence that their future king understood the human cost of political decisions. Later that night, as Catherine and Alexander walked along the castle's battlements under a star-filled sky, they could see the enemy campfires flickering in the distance like fallen stars. The sight was both beautiful and ominous, a reminder that their personal happiness existed in a world that could be changed forever by the morning's events. "Catherine," Alexander said softly, taking her hand as they paused at a window in the ancient stone wall, "I need to tell you something. Tomorrow, I'm leading a patrol to the forward positions. It's dangerous, but necessary. I need to see the situation for myself and demonstrate that the crown is committed to defending our territory." Catherine felt her blood turn cold. The idea of Alexander riding directly into danger was terrifying, made worse by the knowledge that his need to prove himself was partly driven by the criticism their relationship had generated. "Then, I'm coming with you," she said, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. Alexander began to protest, but Catherine cut him off. "No arguments. If we're to face the consequences of our choices together, then we face all of them. Besides, if there are casualties, my healing skills might be needed." The truth was that Catherine was terrified of being separated from Alexander when danger threatened. Their love had created this crisis, and she was determined to share whatever risks it generated. But, beyond her personal fears, she was beginning to understand that her presence might serve a larger purpose. The soldiers' respect for her courage was something that could be built upon, a way to transform their personal symbol into political strength. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the grass like scattered diamonds. Catherine donned the protective clothing that Lady Elena had provided, leather armor designed for mobility rather than heavy combat, practical boots, and a cloak that would blend with the autumn landscape. She felt like a character from one of the adventure stories she had read in the castle library, except that the danger was real and the stakes were higher than any fictional tale. The patrol consisted of 20 mounted soldiers, carefully chosen for their experience and discretion. They rode out from Ironhold Castle as the sun climbed above the eastern mountains, heading toward the forward observation posts that monitored enemy activity. Catherine rode between Alexander and Sir Edmund, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement that she had never experienced before. As they approached the border region, the signs of tension became increasingly apparent. Abandoned farms dotted the landscape, their owners having fled to safer territory. The few people they encountered on the roads hurried past with nervous glances, clearly eager to avoid any association with military activity. The forward observation post was little more than a fortified watchtower positioned on a hill that commanded excellent views of the disputed territory. The soldiers stationed there reported that enemy patrols had been increasingly bold, approaching within sight of their position and clearly assessing defensive capabilities. "There," said Captain Morrison, pointing toward a distant ridge. "They've established a forward camp just beyond that tree line. We estimate at least 50 soldiers, possibly more." Catherine squinted in the direction he indicated and could just make out the smoke from cooking fires and the movement of distant figures. It seemed incredible that such a peaceful-looking scene could represent such a serious threat, but she was learning that war often wore a deceptively calm face until violence erupted without warning. As they studied the enemy positions, a commotion arose from the soldiers manning the watchtower. One of them was pointing urgently toward the northwest, where a cloud of dust indicated rapidly approaching riders. "Messengers," Sir Edmund announced after studying the distant figures through a spyglass. "Riding hard and flying royal colors." The messengers reached them within minutes, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grave with urgent news. Catherine felt her heart sink as she saw their expressions, knowing instinctively that whatever news they brought would not be welcome. "Your Highness," the lead messenger gasped, dismounting quickly and dropping to one knee. "Urgent word from the capital. The northern duchies have formally challenged your right of succession. They're demanding a royal council to determine fitness to rule." And he hesitated, clearly reluctant to deliver the rest of his message. "And," Alexander prompted, his voice deadly quiet. "And there are reports of coordinated attacks beginning along the western borders as well." Our enemies have chosen this moment to test the kingdom's unity. The king has collapsed from the stress and lies near death. You're needed at the capital immediately. Catherine felt the world shift beneath her feet as the full magnitude of the crisis became clear. Their personal choice had indeed precipitated a political catastrophe that now threatened the very survival of the kingdom. Enemy forces were attacking on multiple fronts, while internal opposition challenged Alexander's legitimacy as heir. As Alexander absorbed the devastating news, Catherine realized that their fairy tale romance had become something much more complex and dangerous than either of them had ever imagined. The choice they had made in the Great Hall was no longer just about their personal happiness. It had become the catalyst for events that would determine the fate of the entire kingdom. Standing on that windswept hill, with enemy forces visible in the distance, and messengers bringing news of political upheaval and military threats, Catherine understood that the real test of their love was not whether it could survive opposition or scandal, but whether it could bear the weight of history itself. Their story was no longer just about two people choosing each other. It had become about whether love could coexist with duty, whether personal authenticity could strengthen rather than weaken political leadership, and whether a kingdom could survive the transformation of its future king from dutiful prince to a man who chose his own destiny. As Alexander turned to her with eyes that held both love and terrible burden, Catherine realized that their fairy tale was far from over. In fact, it might just be beginning. But it would be a story written not in the safety of castle gardens and candlelit ballrooms, but in the harsh realities of war and politics, where love would have to prove itself stronger than fear, and where choosing each other was only the first step in a much longer and more dangerous journey. The silence that had fallen across the room that night in the Great Hall was nothing compared to the silence that now surrounded them as they contemplated the magnitude of what lay ahead. But as Alexander reached for her hand, Catherine knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, and that perhaps that was enough to transform even the darkest chapters of their story into something worthy of the love that had started it all.